Mendel's first two laws of inheritance are known as the law of dominance and the law of segregation. And how exactly did he discover these two laws? Well, while experimenting with his peas, Mendel discovered that, lo and behold, when he crossed pea plants with different traits together, only one of the traits would show up in the offspring. For example, when he crossed green pea pods with yellow pea pods, they would only produce yellow pea pods. And when he crossed pea plants with white flowers versus pea plants with purple flowers, the offspring would only have purple flowers. And this is known as the parental generation. And this is the F1 generation, or the offspring of the parental generation. So when Mendel first observed this, he thought, oh, maybe those traits just disappeared altogether, and that's why they didn't appear in the offspring. But when he crossed the offspring, or the F1 generation, with each other, they produced both phenotypes again. So the yellow pea plants of the F generation crossed produced yellow and green pea plants, and the purple flowers of the F1 generation crossed would produce purple and white flowers. So clearly they didn't disappear altogether because they showed up once again. So through more careful experiments, Mendel had enough evidence to conclude the first two laws of inheritance, the law of dominance and segregation. In the law of dominance, Mendel observed that there are dominant traits that can cover up other traits known as recessive traits. So dominant traits versus recessive traits. And in these two examples, the dominant trait is the yellow pea plant, so yellow allele big Y, and the recessive trait is the green pea plant, or little y. And here again, the purple flower is dominant, and the little pea is recessive, or the white flower is recessive. And so it's not that the recessive allele just completely disappeared. It was just masked by the dominant allele, so it was hidden. But the information, the genetic information that codes for the recessive allele is still here within the F1 generations. In the law of segregation, Mendel observed that phenotype was determined by the inherited traits of both parents, but these traits separated when the F1 generation crossbred to produce F2 generations. This was only logical to explain why some flowers were purple while other flowers were white, or some flowers or some pea pods were green while others were yellow in the F2 generation. And we discuss this in more detail in a different video. So in separate videos, we'll be covering the law of dominance and the law of segregation with modern terminology. Mendel could not pinpoint the mechanisms behind his laws, but today we know about genes and alleles and therefore have a much clearer picture about what's going on in the law of dominance. First thing to know, there are recessive and dominant alleles, and to recap, recessive alleles are those alleles that are masked in the presence of other alleles, so they aren't expressed in the presence of other alleles. Dominant alleles are the exact opposite. They're the ones doing the masking. So they are expressed in the presence of other alleles. This is exactly what the law of dominance states. When a dominant and recessive allele pair up together in a genotype, only the dominant trait will show in the phenotype. So let's return to our dog, for example. If dog fur, black fur allele is represented by a big B and is dominant, and the brown fur allele is represented by a little b and is recessive, you have three possible genotypes. You have big B, big B, big B, little b, or little b, little b. So it's obvious that big B, and little b would code for black fur and brown fur respectively, because there's no other allele within the genotype, but big B, little b would not be a brown and black speckled dog. No, because we know that black fur is dominant, and because of the law of dominance, big B, little b will code for black fur in the phenotype. So notice how both big B, and big B, little b code for the same phenotype. They both code for black fur. So that means that when you were to come across, if you are to come across a individual showing the dominant trait, such as a black furred dog, you do not know their genotype, because there are two possibilities. They would either be one or the other. Whereas if you were to come across an individual showing a recessive trait, such as the brown furred dog, you automatically know their genotype because there's only one possibility. And this is also insightful of all other recessive traits. Recessive traits will only show when there are two of them in the genotype. So, you should also recognize that dominant alleles will always be written in uppercase, whereas recessive alleles are always written in lowercase. Let's try another example. If Amy inherits a blue eye allele, or little b, from her mother, and a brown eye allele, or big B, from her father, mom, pop, what color eyes are her eyes going to be? So Amy's genotype is brown-blue, or big B, little b, and because we know brown is the dominant trait, and the law of dominance states that only the dominant trait will show in the phenotype, Amy will have brown eyes. It's just that simple. Law of dominance. Mendel's second law of inheritance is now known as the law of segregation. During gamete formation, a diploid cell will split into 4 haploid cells. Remember, during meiosis I, the homologous pairs separate. This also means that 2 different alleles coding for the same chromosome will separate. So let's try drawing this out. You start with a diploid cell, and we'll just say it has 2 chromosomes to simplify things. And during meiosis I, the homologous pair separates, so each has only 1 chromosome, and then during meiosis II, the sister chromatids separate, and as a result, you have 4 genetically different haploid cells. And so, what this tells us, because each allele coding for the same trait is found on only one of the homologous pairs, that means when the homologous pairs separate, the alleles will separate with them. So for example, if you were talking about pea color, you have a yellow allele and a green allele. The yellow allele would be found on one homologous chromosome, and the green allele will be found on the other. And so when these homologous chromosomes separate into their separate gametes, one gamete will end up with the yellow allele, and the other one will end up with the green allele. So this is what the law of segregation states. 2 alleles coding for the same trait will separate during gamete formation. Mendel didn't know the specifics of genetics when he proposed this law. Pretty smart guy.